Welcome back to the book club. Today's video is going to be a book review on The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This is a book that I've seen a lot of hype about on the fantasy subreddit and various other, fantasy book places where people recommend books. And I was kind of wondering if it lived up to the hype or not. And I can confirm before I even dive into this book review that it does, in fact, live up to the hype. The way that I do these book reviews, I like to rate them on three axes: the three P's: plot, people, and pacing. And then finally, because this is a series of books, my final section is just will I continue reading the series or not? I believe that so far there's three books released in this. I think it's called the Gentleman Bastard sequence. And the fourth book has been on the horizon for a long time. I've sort of gotten the idea that I've seen some comparisons to George R. R. Martin and Patrick Rothfuss, where maybe this is a fourth book that will never come out or not. But I'll talk about that a little more at the end of this review. So to kick it off, what did I think about the plot? I rate the plot a 10 out of 10. This book has some really amazing world building, which kind of surprised me for a book that's sort of about the main plot itself is very Ocean's 11-y. It's about like a thieving group and sort of a heist and the outcome of that. Some wrenches get thrown in the works and they have to work through that. And it's very exciting. There's a lot of twists and turns along the way. But it's not just that. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot of world building that's just sort of incidental that really adds depth to the book and makes it even more exciting. There's a lot of things that are just small to the overall plot, but are still interesting and makes the world feel very deep and lived in and mysterious as well. There's this isn't a spoiler at all, but there's in the book there's like this ancient race of Elden people that are maybe referred to as alien, or maybe I'm just referring to them as alien. I don't actually remember. But they have this elder glass that they've left behind all over the place, and there's like, they reuse this elder glass and make buildings within it or on top of it in various ways. And it's like this small detail that is almost irrelevant to the plot. In some cases, it has very small bits of relevance, but like we don't learn anything more about this ancient group of people. We just know that they've left this stuff behind, and it adds a lot of character to the world. Also, the city itself of Camor is like this. I don't remember the name in Italy now of the city. That's just like a bunch of canals and stuff. But there's a bunch of islands and boats and bridges that go between the islands and all of that. So it really adds a lot of character to the area that they're traversing. It does make it a little hard to keep track in your head. There's 20 different districts that they talk about throughout the book, maybe more than that. So it would have been helpful for me to have a map to understand where they're talking about. But for the most part, it doesn't really matter. It's a lot of like world building stuff that you don't really need to understand to get the book. But I think it adds a lot of depth. And I sort of consider world building as part of the plot. And now the plot itself, I mentioned before, it's a very Ocean's 11 sort of vibe. There's a ragtag group of thief actors who, unbeknownst to them, bite off more than they can chew and wind up becoming part of a larger chain of events. And I think overall, this plot lives up to the hype. I mentioned it before, but it lives up to the hype that I've seen online. It's very exciting. You sort of learn what the title, The Lies of Locke Lamora, mean and how that integrates with the plot, which I think is very fun and interesting. And also, we learn about the backstories of some of the characters in the Gentleman Bastards, which is like their group of thieves. And the way the book is structured, each chapter or almost every chapter has an interlude after it. And these interludes have some backstory about the characters or about the world in a way that's relevant to the plot for the most part. And I think for the most part, again, these interludes were a very interesting way of adding to the world building. As we're learning about the plot, we sort of learn a bit about the backstory, and that backstory later relates to the plot going forward. So I think it was very well put together in that way. Next up, talking about the people, I rate the people an 8 out of 10. The main reason for taking some points off, so the backstories were very fun, but there were characters that we don't really learn their backstory at all. And I can kind of understand the rationale behind it, but also it makes it so that they feel very flat and they're not much deeper than their plot purpose, which I think is kind of a shame because I think that the events that happen in the book would be more meaningful if we had known more about the characters. Because we don't really understand exactly why why they're doing the things that they're doing because we don't know those backstories. We do learn the backstory for, Locke Lamora is the main character. We mostly learn his backstory. It's probably, I don't know, 75% of the backstory that we learn is specifically about Locke. And I think that's good because obviously he's the main character. He was definitely the most fleshed out, but there are other characters who I think would have it would have been better. The overall book would have been better if we learned more about those characters and why they're doing these things. Um, there's this general sense too that the characters don't really seem to have a lot of emotion about what's going on. There's a lot of like brutal, we're talking about thieves and that kind of thing. There's a lot of like brutal events that go on that seem to have very little effect on the characters. And there's some justification as to why, but I feel like it could be or it could have been explored a little bit more. And granted, this is part of a series, so it's possible that that gets expanded on the future. So, maybe I'm just being a little too harsh, but this is also a book that a lot of people say could be you could just treat it as a standalone. Some people don't like the sequel and or the sequels as much from what I've read online. So people do sometimes say that this could just be a standalone. So if I treat it as a standalone, I would say that those areas were kind of still lacking, which is why I'd say the characters are only an 8 out of 10. There could have been more depth there to a few of them. And the last section here is pacing. So I mentioned before each chapter ends with an interlude, and at the start, these interludes are very relevant to the plot. They're backstories to the characters that we just don't, characters we haven't yet learned that much about, or they teach us a little bit about why the character is good at things that they're good at. Because it's like, oh, in their backstory, they did these things, and that's why they're good at impersonating this type of person. But as the book goes on, the interludes get less relevant, and there's actually a foreword. So this is the 10th anniversary edition of this book, and in it there's a couple page foreword by Scott Lynch, and he talks about the writing of the book, and he does actually mention in it that the interludes get a little less interesting as the book goes on, and that was sort of one of the faults that he found with it. So he's definitely acknowledged that that's a problem. I kind of agree that it's a little bit of a problem. The interludes get shorter as the book goes on, but also they just become irrelevant, or not totally irrelevant, but a lot less relevant. And if they didn't exist, it would have been better because the plot's really interesting and fun. And I would have liked to just keep reading the plot rather than read an interlude. So that's one reason why I think the pacing is an 8 and not, a 10. Um, the other point is there's a lot of backstory buildup that happens in the beginning, like the first half of the book, before we realize really where the book's going, and before we start to see any twists and turns and like wrenches thrown into the works. And so, because of this, I think that also takes away from the pacing a little bit. For me personally, I about halfway through the book is when the book became hard to put down because I wanted to keep reading and figure out what was happening. But even the first half was still very interesting. It's just that I think a lot of readers would think it's maybe a little too slow. I like to read through some of the Goodreads comments and stuff after I finish reading a book too, and I saw there were some people who dropped the book in the first like 100 pages because they thought it was boring, and then they picked it back up later and they were like, "Oh my god, why did I do that?" I don't think it's a book where I'd say like you have to really push through and then it's worth it, because I don't think it's really that much to push through. I think if you like heist sort of plots and thieves and reading about assassins and that kind of thing, this will be interesting to you throughout. But it is true that the first half is a lot of buildup that is necessary for the payoff, but the buildup maybe is a little bit slower than the actual exciting finale, as it were. So, last topic now is just will I continue reading this series or not? It's kind of interesting because I did really, really like this book. I do think it's worth the hype. I am also not really sure if I want to continue reading the series. Um, and there's a couple reasons for that. So, one of them is I do think this book worked well as a standalone. I don't necessarily feel like I need to read more to know where it goes. There are some characters that are mentioned that we never actually see in the book, and I hope that they come up in the sequels. So there are some motivations for reading on, but that's one of the reasons is I do think it kind of wraps itself up pretty well. So I don't feel the urge to there's no cliffhangers necessarily where I'm like, oh, I need to keep reading and see where this goes. The other reason is that I may not keep reading it is that because of these comparisons to George R. R. Martin and Patrick Rothfuss, I'm not sure if I'm going to get to book 3, be left on a cliffhanger, and then be dying to finish the series and not have a book to finish. I'm not sure how much, I don't know if the fourth book is the last book or if there's even more planned. Um, but that kind of does put a sour taste in my mouth. I don't know if I want to set myself up for another series on top of A Song of Ice and Fire and The Name of the Wind stuff where I'm just waiting for another book to come out. I will say that if the fourth book does come out, it definitely would motivate me more to read and catch up to it. But for now, I think this is a maybe to probably I will keep reading. I think this will be deep in my to be read list. There's just a lot of other books that I want to read. And I'm not desperate to read the second and third books of the series, even though they do actually have pretty good ratings on Goodreads. The first book had a 4.2, and I think the next two also have 4.2. So it's actually pretty solid. And I do think I would enjoy them, but there's a lot of other books to read. And I'm working on some more completed series at the moment. So, maybe in a couple years I'll finish reading this. Maybe if the fourth book comes out, I'll finish it. But I'm not 100% committed as of now. That's it for this book review. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, I guess let me know in the comments below. Subscribe if you liked it, click the like button, do all that YouTube stuff. If you've gotten this far, I'm going to reward you by letting you know the book that I'm reading now, which is the fifth book of Dungeon Crawler Carl. So the review for that will be coming out probably by the end of this week. I'm already like 100 pages into it, and it's a pretty fast read. And after that, I plan on finishing the Ryria Revelations, and then get back to my Malazan reading and read, I believe, House of Chains is book 4 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. So that's kind of at least my tentative plan for what's up next. Um, Anything after Dungeon Crawler Carl isn't set in stone because that's what I'm currently reading, but that's what it is. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.